Today we're here to discuss the types of evidence. Now, evidence is defined under Section 3 of the Indian Evidence Act. There are mainly two categories of evidence, one which includes statements made before the courts by witnesses in relation to matters of fact under inquiry, that is called oral evidence. The other is documents, including electronic records produced for the inspection of the court, which is called documentary evidence. Now, oral evidence comes under the ambit of Section 59 and 60 of the Act. Oral evidence means and includes all verbal statements which are made by a witness in court. In oral evidence, the witness states the facts by speaking or with gestures. Now, Section 59 of the Act says that all facts can be proved orally except contents of electronic evidence and document evidence. For example, if a crime has been committed and a person has witnessed it, whatever the person testifies in court under oath about what he or she has heard, seen, perceived, or forms an opinion of, all this is considered as oral evidence. Now, Section 60 states that oral evidence must be direct evidence. Now, what is direct evidence? Direct evidence is the testimony of a witness of his own opinion or senses about the existence or non existence of a fact in issue or a relevant fact. It is the evidence about the real point in controversy. Now, for example, A kills B with a knife. C deposes that he saw A with a murder weapon stabbing B. This oral evidence of C is known as the direct evidence, as he has seen the fact in issue, which is the murder, take place. Then we have indirect or what we call circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is when you prove a set of facts which tends to establish the fact in issue. Now, in proving other relevant facts, the cause and effect of the fact in issue may be proved that may lead to a conclusion. So basically, it is direct evidence that is indirectly applied. Now, for example, it is alleged that A killed B with a knife. C deposes in court that he saw A walk out of the room where B's body was found, and he saw A with a splatter of blood on his clothes. Now, what is the direct evidence here? One, that C saw A walk out of the same room where the body was found, and two, A had blood splatter on his clothes. Now, putting C's testimony together, a conclusion can be drawn that A killed B. This is called circumstantial evidence. Now, such kind of evidence is to be resorted to only in case there's no direct evidence available. Now, the Supreme Court, in the case of Sharat Birdi Chand Sardar versus State of Maharashtra, 1984 AIR 1622, has laid down 5 golden principles of circumstantial evidence. First is the circumstances from which the conclusion of the guilt is to be drawn should be fully established. That means it should be established that C should come on the stand and depose that he saw A come out of the same room and A had blood spatter on his clothes. That has to be established. Second, the facts so established must be consistent only with the hypothesis of the guilt of the accused. The circumstances should be of conclusive nature. They should exclude every possibility of any other hypothesis. So there must be a chain of evidence so complete so as to not leave any reasonable ground for the conclusion consistent with the innocence of the accused, and must show that in all possibility the act must have been committed by the accused only. Therefore, there should not be any room left out for any reasonable doubt. Now, when a case squarely rests on circumstantial evidence, the inference of guilt can be justified only when all the incriminating facts and circumstances are found to be incompatible with the innocence of the accused. Now we come to another type of evidence, which is hearsay evidence. Hearsay evidence is that which, when a witness is merely reporting what he himself saw or heard, but through the medium of a third person. Now, evidence of a statement made to a witness by a person who is not himself called as a witness is hearsay. Now, say for example, D, being a witness, states that C told him that he saw A come out of the room where B was found dead and A had blood splatter on his clothes. The oral evidence of D is called hearsay, and when C has not been examined himself to state this under oath, it becomes inadmissible. Now, there are certain exceptions to hearsay. The main exceptions are: one is res geste. The Black Law Dictionary defines it as things done. Under evidence law, words and statements regarding res geste are admissible under the hearsay exception. Now, Section 6 of the Evidence Act defines it as connected with the facts in issue, as facts which form part of the same transaction, irrespective of the occurrence, wherein the word transaction can be interpreted in several ways. Now, the literal meaning of the word res is everything that may form an object of rights and includes an object, subject matter, or status. Now, in this scenario, once the statement is made, it may be further proved during the legal proceedings by another person appearing as a witness, wherein the aforesaid statement is a part of the same transaction. Now, for instance, when the witness arrived at a scene of the crime on hearing gunshots and saw the injured who conveyed the accused's identity, that is admissible under Section 6 since it was part of the same transaction, which is the act of shooting. Now, the statements made or acts done have to be spontaneous and simultaneous to the main transaction. They may be made or done before or after the main transaction, but the time gap has to be very little so as to render it to be res geste. That is, it has to be done or made immediately before or during or immediately after the occurrence of the main transaction. Now, where there's a time gap, where there's enough time for any fabrication to take place, then the statement will not fall under Section 6. Res geste is defined in Section 6 and further illustrated in Sections 7, 8, 9, and 14 of the Act, and they should be read simultaneously. Now we come to admission and confession. Admission and confessions are defined, admission is defined under Section 17 to 23 and Section 24 to 30 is confession. Admission is a statement which provides inference to any fact in issue or relevant fact. Confession, on the other hand, is the admittance by a person of their own guilt in a court of law. Now, unlike admission, confession isn't defined under the Indian Evidence Act. The provisions pertaining to admission are from 20 confession are from 24 to 30. They define the different provisions regarding confessions, like cases where they are irrelevant, which is when a confession is caused by any inducement or threat to life or a promise that, yeah, you'll be let go of if you make this particular statement, or when it is made to a police officer. Now, when there's an admission of liability or confession of guilt extrajudicially, that means out of court, the testimony may be proved through the person to whom such statement was made. So that is one of the exceptions of hearsay. The other one comes under dying declaration. Section 32 talks about dying declaration. When a statement is made by a person as to the cause of his death or as to any circumstances of transaction which resulted into his death, in case in which cause of death comes in question, is admissible in evidence. Such statements in law are called dying declaration. Now, dying declaration is considered to be credible and trustworthy evidence based upon the general belief that people usually who are about to die do not lie. As a result, it is an exception to the hearsay rule. A person who makes a dying declaration, however, must be competent at the time that he or she is making the statement. If it is proved that that person was not competent or not in the right frame of mind when he or she was making the statement, it can be ruled out as inadmissible. The court must be satisfied that the deceased was in a fit state of mind to make the statement after the deceased has had a clear opportunity to observe and identify his assailants, and that he was making the statement without any influence. Once the court is satisfied that the dying declaration is true and voluntary, it can be sufficient to convict the accused even without any further corroboration. The last exception to hearsay is evidence given in formal proceedings. That takes us to Section 33 of the Act, which provides for the usage of statements given by a particular witness in former proceedings. It can be used as evidence in subsequent proceedings where the witness is dead or unable to appear in court, because that statement has already been given in court under oath. Therefore, the same evidence can be used again when he cannot come to court due to him being dead or outside the country. Other than that, there are two more which come under section 34 and 35. Now, 35 defines it as relevancy of entry in public record made in performance of duty, and entries in books of accounts, which comes under section 34. That as well, it comes under opinions of experts, which is provided under 45 and 51. They are admissible as well. These are all hearsay. They have not seen the exact circumstances or the incident that has transpired, but however, they are still admissible in law. Now, coming to expert witnesses, Section 45 makes opinion of specially skilled persons relevant. Now, an expert is a person who, by training and experience, has acquired the ability to express an opinion. The purpose of an expert opinion is primarily to assist the court in arriving at a final conclusion. Now, in general, it may be said that there are two distinct classes of cases in which expert testimony can be admissible. In one class of cases, the facts are to be stated by the experts and the conclusion is to be drawn by the courts. For example, a medical officer gives an opinion that B died due to the stabbing in his chest by a sharp object. That is his expert opinion on the cause of death. It is not the case that the medical officer knows as to who's the person who has committed the crime. So this expert opinion on the cause of death is taken on record, and the court will thereafter, using this cause of death, this opinion, come to a conclusion as to whether the accused were the persons who committed the offense using the sharp object, because the cause of death was a sharp object used. In another group of cases, the experts state the facts and gives their conclusion in the form of an opinion which may be accepted or rejected by court. Now, say for example, a handwriting expert. Handwriting expert testifies that the handwriting sample of B, when compared to a purported signature on a check, does not match. The handwriting expert opines that the signature on the check is not that of B and therefore it must be forged. So, this conclusion given by the expert witness is that the signature on the check is forged. This kind of evidence is known as corroborative evidence. Then we come to something called real evidence. Now, real evidence is that which is brought to the knowledge of the court by inspection of an object and not by way of a witness or a document being produced. For example, A kills B with a knife. The blood-stained knife that is seized by the officers and thereafter produced in court at the time of the trial. That knife is real evidence. Then we have judicial and non-judicial evidence. Judicial evidence is, of course, evidence received by the court in proof or disproof of facts before it. The statements provided by witnesses are termed as judicial evidence. This is evidence produced directly in front of a judge. Non-judicial evidence is the evidence which is confessed outside the court and not in front of the magistrate. This evidence is only admissible if it could be proved in court later as judicial evidence. Now, this was mostly pertaining to oral evidence. Now we come to documentary evidence. Say A and B enter into a contract for supply of goods. Such contract has been reduced to writing. If in the future any dispute arises between A and B, then the original contract will need to be produced in court to prove such an agreement. That is known as documentary evidence. Now, the word document is defined under Section 3 of the Indian Evidence Act. It could be writing on paper by hand or print. It could be a map or a pictorial layout of a flat. It can be a caricature or some inscription on stone. And with technology coming in, of video recording, tape recording, emails, they're all considered to be documents itself. Section 61 to 90 deals with the rules relating to documentary evidence. 61 to 66 deals with how to prove the documentary evidence. Now, there are two types of documentary evidence. One is primary evidence, and the other is through secondary evidence. Primary evidence falls under Section 62. Let's take, for example, my mother wants to gift me a flat. So she executes and registers a gift deed in my favor. If I submit the gift deed in court in its original form, that is not a Xerox copy or a printout, but the original gift deed signed by my mother, then this original gift deed is primary evidence. It's the most superior class of evidence. In primary evidence, say for example, there's A, B, and C. They want to partition their property into 3 respective shares. Each one of them wants a deed stating their proportion of the share. Therefore, 3 deeds can be executed and registered. This is a document in several parts. Now, when this document, which is executed in several parts, each original part shall be construed to be primary evidence. Now we come to secondary evidence. That is mentioned under Section 63 of the Act. A document may be considered as secondary evidence when it is not available in its original form. However, secondary evidence cannot be made admissible mechanically. Now, sufficient reason for non-production of the original document must be shown. For example, say a tenant files a Xerox copy of a money receipt without giving proper reason as to why he does not have the original, then it will not be admissible. He will not be allowed to file this. There are different types of secondary evidence which are mentioned under Section 63. First being certified copies. For example, a document of tenancy is taken from the collectorate, certified by him. Such a copy shall be a certified true copy. By certified, I mean he puts his stamp and signature stating that this is a true copy of the original. That can be admissible as secondary evidence. Now, copies made from the original document by way of a mechanical process which ensures its accuracy can also be submitted. For example, photographs that are developed through negatives or a carbon copy of a receipt, that type of secondary evidence can also be submitted. Now, copies made from or compared with the original document can also be submitted. For example, a medical register with the name of a patient on it. A copy of that page can be filed as secondary evidence. We cannot obviously take the medical register from the hospital and thereafter produce it in court. We can, however, call a witness, that is a person who's working in that hospital, to get the register to court. The judge may compare the copy with the original document, and after realizing that it is exactly the same contents, that may be admitted as secondary evidence. Now, counterparts of documents as against the party which did not execute them can also be admitted as secondary evidence. For example, if one party does not execute his copy of the deed, then the other copy executed by both the parties shall be admissible as secondary evidence. Counterpart of document are primary evidence as against the parties executing them. That is the person who is signing them. Whereas under this clause, they are secondary evidence as against the parties who have not executed them. Execution means signing the document. Then we have oral accounts of the contents of a document given by some person who has seen the document himself. Now, for example, A takes a loan from B, and neither the original copy of the loan agreement nor any certified copy can be found. There's a person X who has read the document. he can come and depose the contents of it, and the same can be admissible as secondary evidence. Now, what is the difference between primary and secondary evidence? Primary evidence is the main source of evidence, while secondary evidence is an alternate source. Primary evidence is usually the general rule to be used if the document exists in original. That is the first thing a lawyer must do, to submit it in original. Whereas secondary evidence is an exception to this general rule when the original, for some reason, is not in its possession. Now, primary evidence has the highest value of evidence, and secondary evidence is lower than that. Primary evidence is considered to be the best piece of evidence, and secondary evidence is not the best evidence, but it's evidence of secondary nature, and it's admitted in exceptional circumstances. That is only when the conditions mentioned under section 65 are satisfied. Now, the conditions mentioned under 65, the first being when the original document is in possession of a person against whom it is to be proved, or any person who's out of reach, say he is not in India, or any person who's legally bound to produce it and does not produce it even after due notice has been given, then secondary evidence can be led. Where the existence and contents of the document have been admitted by a person against whom such evidence is sought or his representatives in writing, secondary evidence regarding the same may be brought before the court. Now, A gives B the loan agreement with a covering letter stating, please find enclosed the executed loan agreement. And B signs on the covering letter stating that he has seen the contents of the same and he has received it. That letter can be tendered as secondary evidence. However, under this, oral admission cannot be proved. You cannot get the clerk on stand to state that he has given this letter to B. Such things are only to be admitted through written documents, such as him signing on the covering letter stating that he has received it. Now, where the original document is lost or destroyed or cannot be produced within any reasonable period of time, secondary evidence may be produced. If the document is lost or destroyed, then some evidence regarding the existence of the original document and also its destruction or loss may be proved. But adequate evidence must be given to show that all means and resources have been exhausted to try and find such document, and thereafter it was impossible to find it. Then secondary evidence can be led. Now, when the original document is not easily movable, like say a scripture on a wall or a monument or some survey work that is being conducted, it is impractical to get that in court. Therefore, secondary evidence by way of copies of the document or the plan or the layout or by way of oral evidence may be admitted. Now, when the original is a public document, a certified copy of the same shall be allowed to be produced as secondary evidence. According to section 74 of the Act, which deals with public documents, a public document is one which is prepared by a public servant in discharge of his official public duties and are available for inspection. Therefore, a judgment or a decree or statements recorded by the court, they are all public documents as they are discharged in the official capacity of a judge, being a public servant. Since all public documents are kept in the custody of some special authority, as a general rule, it can only be proved by secondary evidence by way of what we call a certified copy. So the court is bound to presume the genuineness if such a copy has been certified by the place where the document is at. Now, say for example, a birth certificate issued by the municipality, that is a public document that can be brought on record. An MOA, a memorandum of association of a company registered with the registrar of companies, that is also a public document that can also be obtained by getting a certified copy from them. Now, where the original documents are voluminous, they're too heavy or big to be brought to court, a person shall be asked to go through such documents and give an account of it before the court in order to save time and for the sake of convenience. Such person's skill shall be examined. Now, Section 75 states that all documents which do not form a part of public documents are private documents. That is with respect to documentary evidence. We will come to another sect of documentary evidence, which is electronic records. Now, electronic records are dealt with under Section 65A and B of the Evidence Act. Now, since technology has evolved rapidly, it was bound to be recognized by courts. The Evidence Act was amended in 2000 to include electronic records as documents. Thus, just like other evidence, electronic evidence or digital evidence is also considered as evidence admissible in court if it is relevant. Now, as per the IT Act, electronic records include data, sound, image generated or recorded and sent or received in electronic form. It is electronic evidence or digital evidence. Now, the footages or pictures or call records obtained from sources that are authentic in nature and can be produced before the court and are relevant and admissible are termed as electronic evidence. Examples of electronic evidence are data stored in a computer system or information that's been transmitted electronic like an email. So now sometimes the data relating to primary evidence, which is in the electronic form, is stored on a virtual platform like say iCloud or Google Drive or any other hard drive. It makes it impossible. You can't get the cloud to the court. So it's practically impossible to present it in court by way of primary evidence. Now, primary evidence was in its original form. Over here, it's impossible to get the original form in court. So now it's become a standard procedure to allow secondary evidence when it comes to electronic evidence in cases where it cannot be produced before the court. Now, secondary evidence could be either printed on a paper or an email printed on a paper or a video recording which is stored on a USB or a laptop. These computer outputs will only be admissible after satisfying conditions under Section 65B. Now, these conditions are only to be complied with in a case of secondary evidence, which is in electronic form, and not in case of primary evidence. Now, say for example, you have your CDs, DVDs, hard drives. These kinds of electronic records are admissible as primary as well as secondary evidence. Now, for example, a CD is a primary evidence when the data, the picture, or a video which is to be presented to the court for evidence is generated or recorded directly onto that CD at the source. So, in other words, original media should be stored or recorded directly in that CD without any human intervention. Then it can be put before the court as primary evidence. Now, a CD can be secondary evidence if it is a copy of the original and its duplicated version. But before that, it has to pass the test of authenticity by complying with the conditions under Section 65B. These conditions help to ensure that the computer output, that is the copy of it, is authentic, reliable, accurate, and excludes the possibility of it being tampered with. In the case of, say, a CCTV footage that is probably stored on a huge hard disk, that cannot be presented in court either. So you will have to take a copy of that video footage onto a USB pen drive. That USB pen drive can thereafter be produced in court by way of secondary evidence. So where the data is self-generated or created by itself and first-hand recorded in a CD or a DVD or a hard drive without any human intervention, that is primary evidence. But if the data is transferred or copied to another electronic device, like a pen drive, with some human intervention, which could lead to a possibility of someone tampering with the data, in that scenario, the evidence that is copied or transferred, that will be considered as secondary evidence, and its admissibility will be subject to Section 65B. Now, original audio and video recordings are accepted as valid source of evidence as well. Tape recordings are also recognized. If they are considered relevant to the case, it comes under the ambit of documents. Now, as audio tapes it's very easy to alter them, erase them, re-record, cut out some parts. Therefore, before the court accepts them as evidence, there are various factors which are to be considered. The voice of the speaker must be duly identified by the maker of the record or by others who can recognize his voice. Where the voice has been denied by the maker, it will require very strict proof to determine whether or not it really is the voice of the speaker. Now, every possibility of tampering with that part of the tape recorded statement must be ruled out. Otherwise, it may render the statement out of context. I can easily crop out one audio clipping, merge them with some other audio clippings for it to mean a full conversation, and I can submit that in court. But the fact that it needs to go through the entire veracity of it, it has to stand the test as to whether it has been tampered with. That can be done through some forensic experts that will go through the entire audio clip, and they will be able to tell whether it has been cut into pieces and thereafter joined together to make a full statement. Now, this recorded evidence in the form of, say, a cassette or a CD or USB, it must be carefully sealed and kept in safe custody. That chain of custody also is very important so as to avoid any human intervention to it. The voice of the speaker in that tape recording is to be clearly audible, should not be distorted, should not be muffled. You can clearly hear the exact words that that person is talking about. That is when audio tapes can be used. Now, with respect to emails, there's a presumption under Section 88A of Evidence Act, which the court follows while taking emails as evidence. This presumption is only pertaining to the data fed into the computer, that is the contents of the email. So it presumes that yes, these were the contents in the mail. The mail stated this, but it does not presume that the receiver of that email has indeed received it. So the emails are recognized as a valid source of evidence, but it is only the contents of the email that is recognized. It is not proved beyond reasonable doubt that that person has actually received the email. So emails also are generally submitted by way of printouts along with complying with the sections under Section 65B, subclause 4. Now, mobile phones can also be used as evidence. As per Section 2T of the Information Technology Act, mobile is a computer and an SMS in the mobile is an electronic record. So mobile phones can be used for tracing locations, call records, submitting media like pictures and videos on WhatsApp. If media files which are generated through mobile phones are to be submitted in court as evidence, then in those cases, that mobile phone along with the memory card which was used to store these files is to be submitted in court. Media that's generated through mobile phones can also be submitted through secondary evidence, which is when you're transferring it to a USB pen drive with the help of a computer, thereafter submitting the certificate in accordance with Section 65B4. As per Section 73A of the Evidence Act, for the purpose of ascertaining whether a digital signature belongs to a person, the court may direct that person or the controller or the certifying authority to produce the digital signature certificate in order to prove that yes, this person has digitally signed this document. The court may also direct any other person to apply the public key listed in the digital signature certificate and verify the digital signature purported to have been affixed by this person. So that comes under Section 73A. Now we'll come to Section 65B. Section 65B of the Evidence Act states that admissibility of electronic records in court proceedings. It states that any record which is contained in an electronic or digital form shall be termed as a document. And if the terms specified under Section B of the Act are satisfied, then such document can be admissible in court. Now, what are these conditions? If evidence is adduced during any proceeding before a court by virtue of this section, Then there must be a certificate which identifies the electronic record containing this statement. That certificate must describe the manner in which the electronic record was produced. The certificate must furnish the details of the devices involved in the production of that record. Now, say I'm taking out a printout of an email. I will state on affidavit that I have received this email from so and so person. Contents of the email are as under. I have taken this printout. I have taken a copy of this email, saved it on my computer, which only I use. There, the computer, you have to mention the make and the model of the computer as well. Thereafter, I have printed it out through a printer. You have to mention the make and model number of the printer as well. And thereafter, I have submitted in court, and the contents that are there on this printout are the exact same which is there on the electronic record. So the certificate must furnish all the particulars of the devices involved in the production of that record. Now the certificate must deal with the applicable conditions also, which are mentioned under section 65B subclause 2 of the Evidence Act. These are the information shall be produced during the regular course of activities by the person having lawful control over the use of the computer. Therefore, I have to state that this is my computer, I own it. I'm the only person who does use it. So no one else has had access to this computer in order to tamper with it. Now, the information has been regularly fed into the computer in the ordinary course of activities. During my course of business, I have received this email. It is a complete routine email, and no one else has tampered with this computer. Throughout the material part of the said period, the computer has been operating properly, and therefore the electronic record is not affected. So I have to state that I'm the only person using it. No one else has tampered with it. There has been no virus or anything that has affected my system. The information contained in the electronic or digital records is derived from such information fed into the computer in the ordinary course of the individual's activities. Now, this certificate is not a certificate, it's basically an affidavit of the person who has taken this printout out, testifying in court, stating that I've complied with all these conditions. They are therefore free of any human intervention, and therefore they are not tampered with. And it is the exact same contents as is available on the electronic record. So these are the various types of evidences falling under oral and documentary evidence. So Bharat has asked the gun which used in crime, that gun will come under which type of evidence? That will come under real evidence. If it is seized by the police officer, that evidence comes under real evidence as it is an object. It's known as muddemal in court. Harshit has asked, what are the practical insights on proving evidence in real court? And what are the practical aspects of proving evidence in courts which the books don't tell us? The books don't tell us a lot of things. Most of the things that I have learned is only through practical experience. Harshit, you must get an internship under a trial court lawyer in order to answer this. Whether a Xerox or photocopy is primary evidence of the content of original under Evidence Act. I've come to that. A Xerox or a photocopy, if it is certified or if it is compared with the true original document in court, then it comes under secondary evidence. Whenever a document is submitted in court in its original form, that's primary evidence. If it is a Xerox or a photocopy, it has to be compared with the original document by the judge or the judicial clerk, or else it has to be a certified copy, where this document was in whosoever's official capacity in their office, they have attested to the fact that this copy has been produced from his office and it certifies that the contents of it are the same as the original. Will phone tapping be considered as tampering of evidence? Phone tapping cannot be considered as tampering of evidence. Phone tapping, in fact, there was a discussion on it on whether it can be admissible, whether it comes under it being self incrimination. However, it was ruled that it doesn't come under self incrimination as the person is not testifying under oath. Therefore, phone tapping, the conversations definitely can be used in evidence. Can color printouts of scanned documents be counted as primary or secondary evidence? Printouts will always be counted as secondary evidence. You have to meet with the conditions which are mentioned under 65B, wherein you state that the printout was taken on so and so device. It was on your laptop, thereafter printed out through this printer. Upon stating that the contents that is there on the electronic record and on the copy which is already printed out are the same, that will be admissible in a court of law, but as secondary evidence. Whether a notice sent by WhatsApp will be accepted. Yes, recently, even during the pandemic, Supreme Court has also laid down that we can, in fact, serve notices. What is important, however, is when you are serving a notice on WhatsApp, the person's number should be there on top. Thereafter, the two blue ticks that come once a person reads the message, that has to be seen. So, a printout of that screenshot definitely can be taken. And if you slide that message over, it shows you read and delivered. That printout needs to be taken. And again, you have to comply under section 65B that it has been printed out as received, say on WhatsApp web on your desktop or a screenshot of your mobile. Are WhatsApp chats admissible in evidence? Can be admissible in evidence, but has to be proved as well. And it is not, it's a substantive piece of evidence. It is not definitely 100% reliable. You can always poke holes into that. Same goes with text or SMS messages.
So Lakshmi, from the exam point of view, can you give example of like all the evidences, just example?
So basically, real evidence is that muddemal that is usually there, or any article that has been seized. Circumstantial evidence, I have explained that in terms of they are pieces of direct evidence that corroborates to form into a conclusion that yes, C did see A get out of that room, and thereafter C did see A have blood splatter on his clothes. Therefore, it can be logically assumed that A did kill B. That is in terms of circumstantial evidence. Thereafter, hearsay evidence which is admissible is a dying declaration where a person was say stabbed on the road, taken to the hospital. Thereafter, a police officer goes to him in the hospital. He is in a conscious state of mind to narrate the events that have taken place, that have transpired. If he knows the victim, if he knows the accused, he will name the accused. This will be taken down in writing by the police officer, preferably in a question answer format as well. That is what is known as dying declaration. Then, judicial evidence, of course, is your statements that are given in court. Non judicial evidence is our confessions, which are given to a person outside, wherein C feels really guilty that he had killed A, therefore he runs to his friend B and states that out of revenge, I have done it. That is a confession, that is a piece of non judicial evidence, which is a confession outside court. Then, with documentary evidence, your primary evidence is always in original form, the document. A secondary evidence, a certified copy could be a certified copy of an order in court or a certified copy of evidence that was given by a witness who is no longer alive. That certified copy can be taken as secondary evidence. Copies which are made from an original document by way of a mechanical process, that could be if you are xeroxing a copy of an original, that is another type of secondary evidence where it can be either compared to the original document, or it could be a carbon copy wherein you put that blue paper in, say, like for example, on a rent receipt, when you're writing down the rent, that blue carbon paper is also there. The paper below that, that can also be tendered as secondary evidence. It's not in the original form of handwriting, but the copy is done by way of a mechanical process which ensures its accuracy.
Lakshmi, in practice, how do you apply the best evidence rule?
always primary evidence is considered the best evidence itself. If you It should always be a witness stating to the affirmative if he has directly seen or heard of the incident that has taken place. That should always be given primary importance. For example, in a check bouncing case as well, if there's a loan agreement, that loan agreement should be in its original form. Those real type of evidences with in its original form, those documents are to be given priority, not a WhatsApp message stating that these are our loan agreements, these are our conditions, or an email or a draft copy of it. That evidence should only be looked onto if there is no original piece of evidence that can be tendered in court. Thank you.